Can the warmth of a nameless infant thaw the grief that's frozen a father's heart for years? Before the sun rises over the frozen Vermont hills, a man shattered by grief and a loyal dog discover a secret hidden in the winter silence. A newborn abandoned in a box, her cries barely louder than the wind. With one quiet act, their world cracks open. As the storm outside rages on, three strangers, a father, a daughter, and a German shepherd, must decide. Do you let go, or do you stay and fight for warmth, for hope, for a fragile chance at family? Stay, and you'll see what it means to belong. Dawn came late to the high hills of Vermont, especially in November, when the air turned brittle and the morning pressed close, as if it too wished to stay beneath the covers a little longer. There was frost on the window panes of Lucas Weller's small wooden house, and behind them, the world seemed paused, trees bare and trembling under the pale sky, the town itself still holding its breath. The street outside was empty, only a single set of tire tracks vanishing into the waking hush. Inside, the kitchen was cast in a gentle yellow light. Lucas stood by the counter, the coffee pot hissing softly, a thin curl of steam rising from the chipped mug he cradled in his hands. He was a tall man, his hair now gone mostly to gray at the temples, but the lines of youth still lingered in his face. He wore them the way some men wore medals, a silent record of what had been endured, what had been lost. Across his cheek, the shadow of an old scar traced down to his jawline. Most days he forgot it was there. Today, it ached a little, as if to remind him of how deep November could reach. He sipped his coffee, watching the slow drift of mist beyond the window. Sometime in the night, the world had grown colder, and now a thin veil of fog pressed low against the ground, pooling in the hollows beneath the red maples. Here and there, pockets of last year's leaves huddled together along the fence lines, their color faded to copper and rust. The air outside was silent, almost reverent. In the front hall, Marlowe waited by the door. The German shepherd's fur, dappled with black and silver, caught the faint light and shimmered like an old photograph. He stood quietly, tail swaying just enough to acknowledge Lucas's presence, a question in his eyes, though he would never press for an answer. Marlowe had always been this way, steady, patient, neither demanding nor withdrawn, simply present, as if the space between his breaths belonged as much to Lucas as to himself. Lucas turned from the window, pausing to watch the dog for a moment before setting his mug on the table. The clock above the stove ticked in quiet increments. He reached for Marlowe's leash, the nylon frayed in places from years of gentle worry, and slipped it over the dog's head with a practiced ease. Marlowe's ears twitched, the beginnings of a smile curling at the corners of his mouth. A dog's kind of smile, subtle, built more from hope than from joy. No words passed between them. Lucas had learned, in the aftermath of losing his son, that silence could be a comfort and a curse. Some days, it settled into the house like dust, making every movement feel heavier. Other mornings, it simply allowed things to be what they were. Today, the silence was neither good nor bad. It was just what was left. He glanced at the empty chair by the window, where Josie, his daughter, usually perched on Saturday mornings, legs curled under her, nose buried in some battered paperback. 11 now, growing taller by the month, her voice changing, laughter less certain, but always quick to break the tension that sometimes lived in the house. But today, Josie was not there. It was a weekend she spent with her mother, as most weekends were now. The distance between the two houses was not far, a matter of streets, not miles, but in Lucas's chest, it sometimes felt like another country altogether. He set down the leash and reached for his coat, the wool still faintly smelling of wood smoke. Marlowe waited, eyes gentle, unwavering. In another life, Lucas might have spoken. A quick command, a cheerful greeting, something to fill the air. Now all that was needed was a look, a gesture. The bond between man and dog had been woven through long months of grief and wordless understanding. Marlowe was not a hero, not a legend. He was simply the dog who had chosen to stay, when so many others had slipped away. Lucas tied his boots, moving slowly, each knot deliberate. He opened the door and breathed in the cold, a breath that sharpened his mind and made his heart remember what it was to keep moving, even on mornings when everything in him wished to stop. Outside, the mist pressed against his cheeks, wet and clean. Marlowe stepped into the yard, his paws leaving small marks in the frost. The only sound was the distant calling of a crow and the low sigh of the wind threading its way through the maples. They walked the length of the porch together, Lucas pausing to close the door behind him. No need to lock it. Nothing in the house worth taking, only the traces of a life that was still finding its shape. Marlowe paused at the bottom step, turning back to glance at Lucas, as if to make sure he was coming. Lucas nodded, a silent answer. Down the street, a neighbor's porch light flickered off, and somewhere far away, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Lucas and Marlowe made their way toward the cruiser parked at the curb, the quiet companionship between them enough to fill the space the world had left behind. There was no urgency, no particular destination, just the slow, patient ritual of beginning again. One morning, one leash, one small act of moving forward into the chill. In the quiet that followed, it was enough. The cruiser's engine murmured to life, a low sound that felt almost apologetic in the dawn stillness. Lucas sat behind the wheel, hands wrapped around the heater vent as the windshield gradually cleared. Marlowe settled quietly in the passenger seat, his gaze drawn out toward the empty street and the promise of whatever the morning might bring. Frost traced delicate patterns across the glass, melting slowly as warmth seeped through the vents, revealing the quiet, frost-bitten world in pieces. The town of Morgan's Hollow stretched out ahead, row houses pressed close for warmth, a church steeple piercing the morning haze, a diner still dark behind its neon sign. Lucas guided the cruiser past storefronts and shuttered gas stations, the hush of the engine blending with the soft scrape of tires over frozen pavement. He didn't turn on the radio. He preferred the hum of the car, the sound of Marlowe's measured breathing beside him. There was nothing urgent to break the spell of morning. No calls, no rush. Just the rhythm of routine, the road unspooling in front of him. Leaves, long past their autumn glory, gathered in slow-moving eddies where the wind hadn't reached. Here and there a lone crow hopped between drifts, its wings too heavy for flight. The lake, usually restless with summer life, lay stiff under a thin skin of ice, reflecting a sky the color of pewter. Lucas drove slowly, letting the silence of the town settle inside him. He had learned that some things healed on their own timetable, that there was no sense in pushing the hours along faster than they wanted to go. Marlowe sat up straighter as they passed the school bus depot, his ears twitching. Lucas glanced over, noting the alertness, the way the dog's nose pressed close to the crack of the window. For a few blocks, nothing happened. Just the distant rattle of a garbage truck and the faintest shimmer of blue as the sky began to brighten at the edges. Lucas continued his slow patrol, half listening for the voice of memory, his son's laugh, the slap of a baseball glove, the echo of something lost and unrepeatable. These days he let such memories come and go as they wished. They were no longer as sharp, but still carried a quiet ache. At the edge of the old mill district, where empty warehouses slumped in on themselves and the chain-link fences wore tattered banners from years gone by, Marlowe shifted again. This time he pressed his nose to the window and let out a sound, a soft whine, not urgent but persistent. Lucas slowed the car. The dog's tail thumped twice against the seat, then stilled. His eyes, sharp and expectant, flicked to Lucas and then back to the street. Lucas pulled over near a bus stop shelter, its plexiglass walls fogged from cold and breath. He watched Marlowe for a moment, how the dog's attention seemed to gather and narrow, as if listening for something just beyond human hearing. Lucas killed the engine. The street was deserted. Only the wind moved, nudging stray leaves against the curb, tossing a faded bus schedule against the legs of the bench. He opened the door. The cold pressed in, sharp and insistent. Marlowe leapt down, landing softly on the salted pavement. He stood for a moment, nose lifted, then began to move in slow, deliberate circles around the shelter. Lucas followed, boots crunching in the thin layer of frost. There was no urgency to Marlowe's movements, just a steady, patient searching, as if the dog was reading a language written in scents and shadows. Lucas paused beside the shelter, scanning the empty sidewalk, the chain of footprints leading nowhere. Marlowe circled back, pausing in front of an old, sun-bleached newspaper stand. He sat, lifted his head, and stared at Lucas, waiting, not for praise but for understanding. Lucas felt a shiver run along his arms, the sense that something in the ordinary had shifted ever so slightly out of place. He walked to Marlowe's side, hand resting lightly on the dog's neck. They stood together, silent, eyes turned down the street, as if expecting someone to appear around the next corner. A neighbor late for work, a child dragging a sled. But there was only the wind, and Marlowe's quiet insistence that here, in this moment, something needed to be noticed. Lucas watched his breath cloud in the air, the way Marlowe's ears tilted, not in alarm but in a kind of steady focus that asked a question without words. He thought of all the times he had overlooked the small things, the way his son used to pause at the door, the pattern of his daughter's hands when she was nervous. The past had taught him that most turning points arrived quietly, in the shape of something almost missed. He glanced down at Marlowe, the silent partner who had never demanded more than patience and trust. The two of them, alone on an empty street, with only the morning and the hint of something waiting just out of sight. Lucas exhaled, the cloud of it hanging in the stillness. Marlowe turned his head, meeting Lucas's gaze, holding it for a long, thoughtful moment. There was a choice here, a pause in the routine. Lucas felt it settle in his chest, a gentle push, the nudge of possibility. Sometimes, he realized, it was the smallest signals that mattered most. He reached down, brushing his fingers over Marlowe's ruff, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath the fur. For another minute they stood in that early winter light, surrounded by the quiet of a town not yet awake, the only sound the breath of man and dog mingling with the cold. Lucas knew, without knowing why, that they should not move on. Not yet. Something needed seeing. And so they waited, two souls, one man, one dog, watching the morning begin again, trusting that what came next would find them both ready. The cold sharpened as the morning pressed on, the sky growing paler, as if afraid of its own brightness. Lucas remained near the old bus shelter, hands in his pockets, letting the hush of the street settle into his bones. Marlowe, standing at his side, was unmoving. Ears perked, nose to the air, the steady stillness of a dog who trusts his own senses more than the noise of the world. It was then, in the drifting silence, that Marlowe stepped off the curb, drawn not by any sight, but by the faintest trace of something on the wind. Lucas followed, boots crunching softly on the thin skin of ice that had formed overnight. The air carried a scent that Marlowe seemed to know, something vulnerable, something new. At the edge of the parking lot, behind the cracked base of a sugar maple, a cardboard box leaned into the roots, its flaps shivering in the breeze. The scene was so ordinary, so easy to overlook. The sort of thing that littered back alleys and train stations, reminders of parcels forgotten, deliveries missed, or things left behind by people in a hurry. But Marlowe stopped short of the box and sat, ears pricked forward, not barking, not whining, simply waiting, a sentinel at the gates of some small mystery. Lucas came alongside, squinting through the low haze. The box was battered, its corners softened by damp, and a faded blue wool scarf had been tucked around something inside, like a nest. Marlowe glanced back at Lucas, eyes asking for a gentleness that needed no words. Lucas's breath caught as he knelt, the old pain in his knees flaring up with the cold. He reached out, hands clumsy in thick gloves, and eased the flaps apart. What he saw there was at once so fragile, so unbearably real, that for a moment the morning seemed to vanish. A single point of warmth in a world made of frost, nestled among layers of wool and cotton, was a newborn. Tiny, impossibly small, face flushed pink from the cold, mouth working quietly, hands drawn up close as if to guard the thread of life within. Lucas did not move at first. He simply stared, the shape of his own reflection wavering in the box's plastic lining. He was struck by how light and dark could mingle in one breath, the weight of all that was lost, and the impossible courage of something new fighting to survive. Marlowe leaned forward, muzzle brushing the edge of the scarf, breathing in the newborn's scent. His tail gave a single, slow thump against the frozen ground, as if acknowledging the enormity of what they had found. Lucas reached out, ungloved hand trembling, and touched the back of the baby's wrist, feeling for warmth, for proof. The skin was cool, but the pulse was there, a faint, fluttering spark. There were no words, only the wind, whispering through empty branches, and the rough, uneven cadence of Lucas's breathing. His heart pounded in his chest, memories surging and scattering, the distant laughter of his own child, now gone, and the first gasp of life that had made him a father all those years ago. Here, in the smallest, coldest corner of Vermont, the universe had placed a new beginning in his care. He gathered the box in his arms, careful not to jostle the fragile bundle within. The wool scarf slipped down, revealing a patch of brown hair. The baby's eyes shut tight against the world. Lucas felt the ache of uncertainty. What to do, what to say, how to hold the responsibility that had just fallen, silent and weighty, into his life. He did not rush. He let the moment linger, a slow act of reverence. Marlowe pressed close, his warmth steady at Lucas's side. The two of them, one human, one animal, stood together in the wide, empty street, a hush wrapped around them like another layer of snow. The baby stirred, mouth searching for comfort. Lucas, without thinking, slipped a finger into the baby's palm. The hand curled around it, impossibly small and sure. There would be time later for the world's questions. Who had left the child? What had driven someone to such an act? What the law would require. For now, there was only this. The quiet strength of holding on, the gift of presence, the fragile hope that sometimes survived the coldest nights. Lucas rose, arms full, Marlowe pacing a careful half-step behind. The cruiser waited at the curb, its windows already frosting over. He opened the back door, set the box gently across the seat, and tucked the scarf around the newborn's face. Marlowe leapt in beside them, his body curling protectively near the baby's feet. As Lucas started the engine, he let his gaze rest on the rearview mirror, watching the small bundle, the soft movement of breath, the glint of Marlowe's eyes in the gathering light. No one spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. The road ahead was uncertain, but in this moment, something had shifted, a thread of hope, thin as dawn, strong as love. He let the car idle, letting warmth creep into the cabin, hands resting on the wheel. He listened to the faint sound of the baby's breathing, to Marlowe's steady sigh, to his own heart slowly beginning to find its way forward. The world outside remained unchanged, the sky gray and waiting, but inside, a fragile miracle had taken root. Lucas did not hurry. He waited, letting the silence hold all three of them together in the gentle grip of morning. The drive home was slow, the cruiser floating along familiar roads that looked strange now, each turn weighted with the presence of the child in the back seat. Lucas's hands held the steering wheel gently, fingers trembling not with cold, but with the unsure grace of someone carrying a secret through a sleeping town. The heater hummed, blowing warm air across the baby's small form. Marlowe sat close, never taking his gaze from the bundle, every muscle drawn to alert, as if sensing the fragile boundary between warmth and loss. Out the windshield, the land stretched away in all directions, fields lying quiet under a thin crust of ice, stone walls veiled in hoarfrost, maples etched black against the morning light. Lucas watched it all with a kind of removed attention, his mind swinging back and forth between the present and all the days that had come before. Memories pooled behind his eyes. The first time he'd driven these roads after his son's funeral, the numbness that never quite left, the ache that rose up at odd times, the smell of rain, the sound of a ball game, the hush of winter dusk. He glanced at the baby, checked the rise and fall of its chest, then found Marlowe's eyes in the mirror. There was no sound in the car but the low whir of the vents and the steady breathing of a dog that understood what it was to keep watch. Lucas reached back at a red light and brushed the back of his knuckles against the child's cheek. The skin was warm now. The baby twitched, a faint sound escaping, part sigh, part plea, part promise that life would keep pressing forward, even when no one was sure how. He remembered then the hospital, years ago, the machines that had measured his own son's breaths, the pulse line that wavered and then, at last, flattened. The memory struck with a clean, cold force, and for a moment Lucas had to pull the car to the side of the road. The world was too bright, the air too full of something he could not name. He sat there breathing in shallow sips, gripping the steering wheel as if it might keep him tethered to now, not then. Marlowe whined softly, nose pressed to the back seat. Lucas reached over, hand finding the dog's ruff, letting himself anchor to the silent faith that Marlowe always offered. The two of them, a man and a dog who had seen too much of leaving and too little of arrival, sat in that cold dawn beside a nameless child, the horizon a line of silver on the edge of a long, unspoken promise. The phone vibrated in Lucas's pocket. He wiped his eyes before answering, forcing his voice steady. Josie's name appeared on the screen. His daughter, his bridge to all that had not been lost. Her voice was soft, still wrapped in the sleep of children who trust morning to arrive. "Dad, why aren't you home? You said we'd have pancakes." Lucas closed his eyes, let the silence between them linger. "I know, Joe," he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something happened. I'll be home soon." He wanted to tell her about the baby, about the box, about how the world sometimes placed more in your hands than you thought you could carry. But he couldn't. Not yet. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He listened for a tremor in her words, something like worry. "It will be," he said, the words as much a hope as a promise. I have a lot to think about." "Okay," she replied. "I'll wait." He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his coat, and let the silence return. Outside, a crow glided over the fields, winging its way toward the cluster of woods that ringed the town. Lucas eased the car back onto the road, the baby in the back seat quiet again, Marlowe's head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but always aware. By the time they reached home, the sun had risen above the trees. Its light spilled through the kitchen window, painting the walls with gold and shadow. Lucas unlocked the door, ushered Marlowe in, then carried the box into the warmth. He set it on the kitchen table and just looked at it for a while. The patchwork scarf, the small fists working in the air, the face so new and unclaimed by any history but the present moment. He didn't rush to take the child out. He let the warmth fill the room, let Marlowe circle and settle at his feet, let the weight of everything that had happened breathe out of his bones. He poured a cup of coffee he did not drink, hands wrapped around the mug for the comfort of something steady. The phone sat silent on the counter. There were calls he knew he should make: hospital, child services, maybe the sheriff's office in the next county. But he waited. The rules could wait for a little while. Some things needed the hush of time before the world arrived with its answers and paperwork and questions he wasn't ready to face. After a while, he lifted the baby from the box, felt its weight settle into the crook of his arm, so much lighter than he remembered, yet heavy with a trust he hadn't felt in years. Marlowe rose, placing his chin on Lucas's knee, watching the baby with the same careful awe that Lucas felt inside. The house, so long hollowed out by grief, began to feel something like full again, as if a light had moved in and found its place among the shadows. Lucas sat at the table, the baby in his arms, Marlowe close, and just let the quiet stay. He did not know what would come next. He only knew that here, in this moment, nothing was required but presence. A man, a dog, and a child, sharing the dawn and the space between heartbeats, letting life write its own next line. The wooden house had always been a place of shadows and memory, its beams holding tight the voices of days long past. As Lucas crossed the threshold with the child pressed gently to his chest, Marlowe brushed past his legs and circled the room, nose low to the floor, tail moving in slow, uncertain sweeps. There was no urgency, only the careful attention that comes when something precious has been entrusted to you by accident or fate. Lucas laid the infant, still swaddled in blue wool, on the old couch. Sunlight had begun to spill across the floorboards, but the room was cool, the faint smell of last night's wood smoke still in the air. He moved quietly, filling the kettle, placing it on the stove with hands that barely trembled now. Marlowe settled on the braided rug beside the couch, body curved around the spot where the child lay, his eyes half closed but never fully drifting away. For a time, Lucas did nothing. He stood in the kitchen, arms folded, watching the rhythm of the baby's breathing, the small flutters of fists and feet beneath the blanket. He thought about what to do, who to call, what to say, the right words for the wrong kind of morning, but every idea felt heavy, too complicated for this new hush that had settled over the house. Outside, the world was all winter brightness and silence, but within these walls, another kind of quiet grew, one that belonged not to emptiness, but to waiting, to listening, to letting something unfold at its own uncertain pace. Lucas found himself moving more slowly, as if afraid that any sharp sound might shatter what had only just begun. Josie's arrival was gentle as snow. The old truck door banged in the driveway. Then the sound of boots on the porch, a quick tap on the door, and she slipped inside. Hair mussed from the wind, cheeks pink with cold, a canvas bag bumping at her hip. She hesitated just past the threshold, boots squeaking against the mat, and looked from her father to the small shape on the couch. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she shrugged off her coat, moved toward the couch, and crouched beside Marlowe, her hand resting on the dog's back. The dog leaned into her, as if they shared an understanding of the fragile thing between them, neither threatened nor protective, just there, holding a kind of vigil. Lucas watched the two of them, father and daughter, dog and girl, encircling the new arrival with a silence that felt more like reverence than fear. Josie's fingers brushed the edge of the blue scarf, pausing as the baby's hand flexed and stilled again. She didn't ask whose child it was, or why the house felt so different. The questions could wait. She only whispered, so small, almost to herself, as if afraid to draw too much attention. Lucas made tea he barely tasted, moved through the motions of breakfast, his mind turning over what was right, what was necessary, what was simply kind. Marlowe, never far from the couch, shifted each time the baby moved, his dark eyes following every small noise, every sigh. He did not whine or bark, simply breathed in time with the others, a steadying presence in the shifting day. When Josie finally spoke again, it was only to ask if the baby was hungry. Lucas nodded, unsure, and found a bottle at the back of the pantry, a relic from a time when the house rang with another child's laughter. Josie filled it, warmed the milk with the unpracticed hands of a girl not quite grown, and settled herself beside the couch, legs tucked beneath her, bottle in hand. The baby's mouth found the nipple, and for a moment, the room was nothing but the sound of gentle sucking, the low hum of the kettle, the soft scrape of Marlowe's claws on wood. As he shifted to be nearer, Lucas watched them, Josie careful and awkward, cradling a life that seemed both impossibly delicate and impossibly brave. Marlowe's ears twitched, his body forming a loose barrier between the baby and whatever ghosts still moved through the corners of the house. The morning unfolded in this way, slow, with more silence than speech, more watching than action. Lucas busied himself with small tasks, folding a blanket, refilling the kettle, gathering wood for the stove, his eyes returning, always, to the scene in the living room. He could feel the old pain loosen its grip just a little, as if the house itself was learning to breathe again. There was no need to rush. The world outside could wait. For now, all that mattered was the warmth of bodies gathered close, the fragile peace that came with sharing a quiet task, the simple act of being present for something that had not been planned, but that had arrived all the same. In the afternoon, as the light shifted and the shadows grew long, Josie curled beside the baby, her head against Marlowe's flank. Lucas sat nearby, silent but attentive, watching as his daughter's eyelids fluttered and finally closed. Marlowe's breathing deepened, the child's hands unfurled in dreams. The house, for the first time in a long time, felt not haunted, but held, a vessel for hope as tentative and beautiful as the dawn. He let the fire burn low, the tea cool on the table. He watched and listened and waited, letting the stillness linger. Some things, he knew now, could only be healed by time and by company. The slow restoration of a life built not from words, but from the quiet agreement to stay, to witness, to care. And as dusk fell over the roof, Lucas whispered his thanks to whatever grace had delivered this moment, trusting that tomorrow would come in its own good time. The night came early to Lucas's house, arriving long before the world outside had finished with its gray, winter tasks. The windows glowed with the faint, golden light of the old lamps. The storm door rattled gently in the wind, and somewhere distant, a neighbor's barn perhaps, a hinge creaked. A reminder that even in silence, there was always movement. Inside, 3 souls and a dog found themselves drawn into the rhythms of care, each giving what they could to the fragile thread of new life resting in their midst. Lucas moved through the rooms as dusk deepened, carrying a sense of watchfulness that didn't feel like duty, but something gentler, a responsibility softened by hope. He folded blankets over the back of the couch, checked the fire in the stove, counted the tiny socks and shirts Josie had found in an old drawer, relics of childhood that still remembered the shape of small hands and feet. The air in the house was tinged with something sweet. Warm milk, wood smoke, the faint scent of pine that drifted in each time the door was opened, even for a second. Josie took charge in the quiet way of children who have lost something and know how to hold on to what remains. She rocked the baby with the kind of patience she rarely showed in any other part of her life, whispering old lullabies in a voice that was sometimes only a hum. Marlowe lay stretched out by the crib, never quite sleeping, always listening. His ears would twitch at the slightest movement, his tail thumping softly against the floor when the baby stirred. He seemed to know, without being told, that his place was here, holding a silent vigil through the night. They made do with what they had. Lucas improvised a cradle from a basket lined with towels. He boiled water for bottles, spilling a little in his hurry, then mopping it up before anyone else could see. His hands were large, unpracticed. The bottle would sometimes tip, the powder clouding in the air before dissolving. Josie would giggle softly, catching the spills with the ease of someone who had learned that mistakes were just another part of being present. As midnight approached, the wind outside grew sharper, tossing snow in whirls against the glass. The old house creaked and settled around them, its bones warming to the closeness of bodies gathered together in the living room. The baby, wrapped tight in blue wool, slept in short bursts, waking with a cry that never rose above a plea. Josie was there first, every time, lifting the child and holding her close, her hands awkward but certain, her face shining in the half-light. Lucas watched them, heart heavy with the ache of memory. He remembered other nights, years ago, when he had sat in the same chair, rocking a son who coughed through long winters, tracing hope and fear in equal measure along the boy's brow. He remembered the last time, how he had measured each breath, each pause, and how the dawn had seemed impossibly far away. Grief, he learned, did not fade. It simply changed its shape, taking up residence in the quietest parts of your life, returning sometimes as a sigh, a shadow, a sudden rush of gratitude for what was left. In these long winter hours, no one spoke of loss or of what would come next. Josie hummed, Lucas tended the fire, Marlowe watched with steady eyes. The baby slept and woke, her small noises echoing through the house like questions only time could answer. The night was punctuated by small rituals: warming milk, folding a blanket, whispering a prayer that was never named as such. Sometimes Lucas would pause by the window, looking out at the line of trees, their branches silvered with frost. He'd think of the mother, somewhere out there, perhaps listening to the wind, wondering if her child was safe, if she would ever know peace again. He did not judge, did not imagine her face or circumstances. He only sent a silent promise into the darkness. Tonight, she is warm. Tonight, she is held. Marlowe shifted closer to the crib, resting his head on the wooden slats, breathing in the scent of the child, the house, the people he had chosen. He blinked slowly, content to be in the company of those who needed him, who asked nothing more than that he stay. The baby reached out in her sleep, a fist curling in the air, and Marlowe pressed his nose gently against her hand. Lucas returned to his chair, the weight of sleep heavy on his shoulders, but he did not go to bed. Instead, he watched the embers in the stove, the glow painting the walls in orange and gold. He listened to the breathing, the baby, Josie, even the dog, and felt for the first time in years that he was not alone. The house, quiet and imperfect, had become a sanctuary, not from grief, but for life's small, persistent miracles. There was no promise for tomorrow, only the warmth of now, the hush of 3 people and a loyal dog finding their way through the long winter night, together, with nothing to say and everything to hold. Morning crept into the house on soft, gray feet, bringing with it the hush that follows a night of snow. The windows glimmered with fresh frost, faint blue light pressed against the glass, as if asking permission to enter. Josie lay curled on the couch, her arm draped protectively over the baby, both their faces softened by sleep. Marlowe was already awake, his nose pressed to the cold air at the door, ears shifting to every distant sound. The postman's boots on the walk, the wind teasing the bare maple limbs, the faint lost bell of a neighbor's dog. Lucas had slept little. Instead, he drifted between the kitchen and the living room, making coffee, stoking the stove, pausing to watch his daughter and the small stranger their life had gathered in. He felt the pull of the old ache behind his eyes, but also something quieter, a steadiness, a sense of being needed in a way he could almost trust. He noticed the blanket as he carried the baby to the window, lifting her so she could see the world turning blue and gold with the rising sun. The wool was faded but thick, the knitting tight, careful. Along one corner, a line of thread, barely visible, had been stitched in a looping, uncertain hand. 3 letters. The middle one a shape peculiar to the region's old French families whose names he'd heard again and again during his years teaching history in town. It was a small thing, easy to miss in the ordinary rush, but in the silence of morning, nothing went unnoticed. He set the baby back in the cradle, tucking the blanket around her, and sat at the table with a pen and a slip of paper, copying the letters with care. Marlowe watched, tail sweeping in the dust. Lucas ran his thumb over the paper, the memory of chalk dust and student laughter echoing faintly in the back of his mind. There was comfort in small mysteries, the kind that asked for patience, for a kind of faith that the world still hid gentle surprises. When Josie woke, she found her father at the table, the baby cooing in her basket, Marlowe's chin resting on Lucas's knee. Josie's first words were a whisper, a question not about breakfast, but about the baby's name. Lucas smiled, a small, worn smile. "Not yet," he said, his voice barely rising above the sound of the kettle. "Some names come slow." Later, Lucas wrapped the baby in a second blanket and tucked the lettered one under his arm. He dressed for the cold, Josie bundling herself beside him, a girl determined to be helpful without asking too much. Marlowe waited at the door, leash dangling, his patience infinite. They set out into the weak winter sun, breath steaming, boots crunching on the icy steps. Their first stop was Mrs. Mathis's laundry. The bell above the door rang softly, a sound that always reminded Lucas of school days, the start and end of things. Mrs. Mathis, small and sharp-eyed, recognized Lucas at once and offered her usual smile, part kindness, part curiosity. Lucas handed her the blanket, careful not to say too much. She studied the stitching, her fingers gentle, her memory reaching back over decades of other people's lives. She shook her head, but her eyes lingered on the letters, tracing them as if they might come alive. They moved on, down the block to old Mr. Giroux, who had once been the postmaster and still knew every name for miles, to the corner store, where Mrs. Chen kept a notebook of everyone's birthdays and family trees. Each person took the blanket, traced the letters, told a story, sometimes related, sometimes not, of a family that once lived near the railroad, a woman who used to knit for the church, a girl who left town after the mill closed. No answers came, but Lucas and Josie listened, grateful for the gift of stories, for the way people wanted to help even when help was mostly hope. All the while, Marlowe led the way, pausing at each threshold, nosing his way into warm kitchens and cool, cluttered porches. Sometimes he lingered by a photo or a coat rack. Sometimes he simply sat and waited for the next gentle hand, the next quiet voice. He was not a detective, not a hero, just a dog who knew the sound of sorrow and the way people softened when a child was in need. The day passed like this, slow and gentle, a patchwork of conversations and half-remembered names, the blanket growing heavier with meaning, even as its origin remained hidden. Lucas and Josie walked home in the last light, snow beginning to fall again, the baby warm and sleeping in Josie's arms, Marlowe pressing close against Lucas's leg. They said little on the walk back, each lost in thought. The father weighing the limits of what he could do, the daughter dreaming of names, the dog trusting in the ritual of return. The house welcomed them with warmth and the faintest scent of cinnamon, a promise that the search would go on tomorrow and the day after, as long as it took. Lucas hung the blanket over the back of the chair and sat with Josie by the fire. Marlowe curled at their feet, the baby breathing slow and sure in the hush. The world outside drifted deeper into winter, but inside, in the shelter of the long search, there was no hurry. They had found each other, and for now, that was enough. It was late afternoon when Lucas found himself standing at the edge of town, the blanket folded under his arm, Marlowe at his heel. The air was brittle with cold, the kind that made every breath a gentle ache. Josie had stayed behind to watch the baby, promising to keep the house warm and the bottle ready. Lucas left her with a smile, tracing his thumb across her cheek, the way he had when she was small, both of them pretending not to notice the way goodbye always caught in their throats. He walked quietly past the last row of houses, boots leaving single, careful prints in the thin new snow. Marlowe moved ahead, not pulling at the leash but guiding by example, a silent escort through the hush of winter fields. The path skirted the woods, led by memory and the half-whispered suggestions of old neighbors. In this small town, stories traveled faster than wind, and someone had said there was a cabin beyond the creek where a young woman had been seen, a woman who wore sorrow like a second coat. The sun hung low, brushing the bare tops of the maples with gold. Lucas paused on the bridge, looking down at the creek, now a narrow ribbon of black beneath the ice. He listened for a moment, for the old voices, for the sound of his own life before so much had been lost. Then he moved on, Marlowe beside him, the cabin coming into view among the pines. Weathered boards, a broken shutter, smoke rising in the cold, blue air. He knocked softly, the sound swallowed by the snow. There was a pause, a shifting of light behind the thin curtain, and then the door opened. She was younger than he expected. Clara, her name rising to him on a memory of gossip and quiet compassion. She stood in the half-light, hair pulled back, face pale and raw, as if sleep and tears had both been strangers for a long while. Her eyes flickered over Lucas, landed on Marlowe, softened a little at the sight of the dog, then settled on the blanket he carried. Lucas did not announce himself as a sheriff. He only held out the folded wool, his hands steady, letting the silence say what words could not. She reached for it slowly, holding it as if it might break, her gaze sharpening at the sight of the familiar letters stitched in the corner. She pressed the blanket to her chest, blinking once, the edges of her mouth trembling. Not a smile, not a sob, something softer and more difficult to name. "It's hers, isn't it?" she said at last, voice so small the wind nearly took it. Lucas nodded. The pause stretched long between them. He felt the weight of every question he wanted to ask. Why here? Why alone? Why leave the child in the cold? But he kept his hands at his sides, his mouth closed. Some wounds, he knew, could not be pried open. They had to be offered, gently, if at all. Clara stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. The cabin was spare, a wood stove ticking in the corner, a single cot, a battered kettle whistling softly on the iron. She motioned Lucas to sit, but he remained standing, Marlowe at his side. She looked down at her hands, twisted the blanket in her lap, then spoke again, the words spilling out like water from a cracked cup. "I thought I could do it," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I thought if I left her where someone would find her, she'd have a chance. My heart." She pressed her fist to her chest, as if to steady something that wouldn't be stilled. "My heart has nothing left. Not for her, not for me. But if you found her, if she's safe, I'll take what comfort there is in that." Marlowe padded forward, resting his head on Clara's knee. She reached down and let her fingers sink into his fur, her body curling a little over the weight of the blanket, the dog's warmth, the old grief that rose in the silence. Lucas watched, offering nothing but presence, his own sorrow echoing hers, the ache familiar and strangely welcome. For a long time they said nothing. The light shifted in the window, dust motes turning in the last gold rays of day. Lucas let the hush linger, let Clara's grief settle around them like snow. She did not ask about the child's name, did not ask if she could see her. She only clung to the blanket, her shoulders trembling, her eyes closed, as if in prayer. At last, Lucas placed a hand on her shoulder, solid, wordless, a promise that could not change the past, but might steady the future. He did not offer judgment or advice, did not speak of the paperwork that would follow, or the system that might never understand the language of a breaking heart. He simply stood beside her until the tears quieted, until she could lift her head and look him in the eye, weary but a little less alone. He left her there in the blue dusk, Marlowe pausing at the door, offering one last nuzzle of comfort. The path home felt different, heavier, but also somehow lighter, as if the burden had been divided, carried now by two people and a loyal dog who knew in his bones that some journeys had to be made in silence. When Lucas reached the edge of the town, lights glimmered in the windows, warmth calling him back. He thought of Josie and the child, and the way a single, fragile thread could bind strangers, could make a family out of longing and loss. He paused in the dark, breath rising in the cold, and let the sorrow and the solace share the same space in his heart. He turned toward home, Marlowe beside him, neither speaking, both understanding. The night settled quietly over the hills, and somewhere, in a small cabin among the pines, a woman held a blanket close, remembering that even when nothing seemed possible, someone somewhere might choose to stay. The day ended the way winter days always did in Vermont. Abruptly, the blue draining from the sky until nothing remained but a thin line of copper on the far edge of the hills. Lucas's house was warm, the stove glowing, Josie sitting on the floor beside the crib, humming a tune that had no name. The baby was sleeping, her breaths so small, so even, they seemed to make the whole room gentler. Marlowe lay close, his side pressed against the crib, his chest rising and falling in time with hers. Lucas hung his coat behind the door, shook the snow from his boots and stood in the entryway, listening to the smallness of the world. He watched Josie, how careful she was, the way she stroked the baby's hair, how her face changed when she thought no one was looking, older somehow and more hopeful, the way only children who have lost something early can be. For a long while he did nothing but let the sight of them fill the cold places inside him. Supper was quiet. Lucas made stew from what he found in the cupboard, the carrots a little soft, the potatoes cut small so the baby would not wake from the sound of chopping. Josie ate cross-legged on the rug, Marlowe's head in her lap, the baby's tiny hand wrapped around her finger. Lucas sat at the table, his own hand still, the spoon resting in his bowl, watching the three of them as if trying to memorize a painting that could disappear at any moment. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing the windows with soft, restless palms. Inside, the room grew dim, the only light the fire and the small lamp by the crib. Josie finished her supper, set her bowl aside, and climbed into the big armchair, baby cradled in her lap. Marlowe curled on the floor beside them, the curve of his body fitting the arc of the chair. Lucas sat opposite, his hands clasped together, elbows on his knees. The night pressed in. No one spoke for a long time. The house settled, wood creaking, the stove ticking, the old pipes murmuring their secret language. Lucas watched his daughter, watched the baby, watched Marlowe, watched the light shifting on the walls. He felt the tug of all the decisions waiting for him, all the forms he would have to fill, all the rules he would have to remember and then maybe break. But in the quiet, those things seemed smaller, as if the house itself was shielding him from the noise of the world. Josie spoke first, her voice low, uncertain. "Dad," she said, barely above a whisper, "if everybody keeps leaving, there won't be anyone left to stay." She ran her hand over the baby's back, slow and steady. "I don't want her to go. I want her to stay here, with us, with Marlowe. I don't care if it's not forever. I just want her to be somewhere she can belong." Her words settled into the room, deeper than the shadows, deeper than the ache that lived in Lucas's bones. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands, letting the weight of the question live between them. He looked up at Josie, at the baby blinking in her lap, at Marlowe's watchful eyes. For a moment, the years fell away, all the losses, all the endings, all the ways he had failed to keep things from slipping through his fingers. What remained was this: a girl who had learned how to love without conditions, a dog who stayed, and a child whose name had not yet been spoken aloud. Marlowe shifted, lifting his head to meet Lucas's gaze. There was no urgency in his eyes, no command, only a steady, silent patience. Lucas felt something pass between them, not instruction, not permission, but a kind of shared understanding, as if the choice had been made long before tonight. To stay, to hold on, to give what you could, even if it wasn't enough, even if it couldn't last. Lucas rose and walked to the window, pressing his palm to the glass. The world outside was white and wide and full of emptiness. But inside, there was warmth, a fragile cluster of hope. He watched his reflection, the lines on his face, the tiredness in his eyes, the shape of the man he had become. He let himself feel the fear of failing again, of losing again, of choosing to love what could always be taken away. Behind him, Josie settled the baby in the crib, covering her with the blue blanket, Marlowe standing guard as he always did. Josie came to Lucas's side, slipping her small hand into his. "Dad," she whispered, "we can just try, that's all." He squeezed her hand, letting the words hang between them. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He just stood with her in the dark, letting the weight of the decision live in the quiet. The fire flickered. The baby slept. Marlowe watched, his tail tapping softly against the floor, a signal that did not ask for anything more than this: to remain. For one more night, one more winter, as long as hope could last. The night ebbed away quietly, the hours marked only by the low ticking of the stove and the gentle shifting of sleepers in their beds. At first light, Lucas rose before anyone else. He moved softly through the rooms, careful not to disturb the hush that lingered in the corners of the old wooden house. Outside, a thin mist curled between the maples, and on the distant hills, the snow began to glow faintly beneath the gentle pressure of the coming sun. He paused by the crib, one hand resting on the rail. The baby slept, her fingers wrapped around the edge of the blue blanket, her lips parted in the deep trust of dreamless rest. Marlowe was beside her, his head pressed against the wood, his breath slow and even. Josie was curled on the other side, arms tucked close, hair tumbling across the pillow. For a moment, Lucas stood simply watching, letting the sight of them, his daughter, the child who had arrived out of the cold, the loyal dog, sink into his chest. He closed his eyes and let gratitude well up, quiet and unexpected. He dressed, pulling on boots and coat, and stepped onto the porch. The air was sharp and clean, the world washed of yesterday's sorrow. He walked into the yard, each step marking a new beginning in the brittle crust of snow. The sun lifted above the ridge, casting long beams through the bare limbs, lighting up the frost on the eaves, turning everything gold and new. Lucas found himself breathing easier. He reached out, brushing the snow from the top step, feeling the cold bite his skin in a way that reminded him of living, of sensation, of the steady work of carrying on. He thought about the paperwork he would file that morning, the decision to foster, perhaps one day to adopt. He thought about what would be asked of him, of Josie, of all of them. He did not know how the story would end, or how many goodbyes might come before the next chapter. He only knew that, for the first time in years, hope felt less like a risk and more like a promise. Inside, the house began to stir. Josie shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, hair wild, her voice a small whisper in the warmth. She poured cereal for herself and sat by the window, legs swinging, humming to herself as the light brightened. Marlowe followed, moving quietly, settling beside her feet, his eyes half closed, content in the company of morning. The baby woke soon after, a soft, questioning cry. Lucas lifted her from the crib, pressing her close, feeling the warmth of her against his chest, the gentle weight of trust. He sat in the old rocking chair, watching the room fill with sunlight, letting the hush of contentment settle over them all. Time passed slowly. Josie brought over a drawing she had made. 3 figures beneath a wide yellow sun, herself, Lucas, and the baby, with Marlowe sitting protectively at their side. She handed it to her father without a word, and he pinned it to the fridge, letting it join the old photos, the reminders of family that had come before and that, now, were being quietly remade. The day unfolded in the manner of true healing, not with grand gestures, but with a series of small, ordinary mercies. Lucas filled out forms, his handwriting steadier than he remembered. Josie played on the rug, making the baby laugh with nonsense words and silly faces. Marlowe watched over them all, moving from one room to another, never far from either child or grown-up, as if his very presence was a promise that no one would be left behind. In the afternoon, Ruth from next door knocked on the door, carrying a loaf of bread still warm from her oven. She did not ask questions, only smiled and set the bread on the counter, her eyes shining with the silent knowledge of someone who had seen enough winters to understand what mattered and what didn't. Josie invited her in for tea, and the 4 of them, 5 counting Marlowe, sat in the kitchen, passing bread and stories, laughter and silence, as the daylight began to fade. Later, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the house grew quiet again, Lucas stood at the window, the baby sleeping in his arms, Josie reading beside the stove, Marlowe stretched long and loose on the rug. The peace was imperfect, incomplete, but it was peace all the same. He watched the snow fall softly outside, the flakes catching in the last golden light, and felt himself, heart and soul, begin to thaw. For the first time in a long time, Lucas did not fear what might come tomorrow. He understood now that healing was not about erasing grief or banishing loneliness. It was about letting life in, letting others stay, even when it meant carrying more than you thought possible. It was about choosing, again and again, to remain, to be a shelter in the storm, a warmth in the cold, a hand reached out across the darkness. And so, beneath the new dawn, in a house where sorrow and hope lived side by side, Lucas Weller made a quiet promise: to love, to hold, to stay. Not perfectly, not forever, but enough. Marlowe lifted his head, as if he too felt the morning's change, the slow, bright rising of something worth believing in. The baby sighed in her sleep, a small fist closing over Lucas's finger, and Josie looked up from her book, meeting her father's eyes, and smiled. The world outside remained uncertain, but within these walls, warmth had returned, fragile and fierce and real. That, Lucas thought, would always be enough. As the snow drifts quietly against the old wooden house, a new warmth lingers, one built not from perfection, but from the choice to stay, to hold on, and to begin again. Sometimes family finds us in the loneliest places. Sometimes hope arrives on 4 silent paws or in the weight of a child's hand. We are all, in the end, stitched together by the small acts of kindness that keep us from the cold. If this story has found a place in your heart, I invite you to share what home means to you, or a quiet moment when compassion made all the difference. Perhaps, like Lucas and Marlowe, you've learned that belonging is not about blood, but about the gentle courage to let someone in. Your story may be the light someone else needs tonight. Thank you for being here, and for choosing, like them, to stay.